Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Shakti Butler, an independent filmmaker and a strategist in the fight against racism in America. Join us for this fascinating conversation with someone on the front lines of social change. Would you talk to us a little bit about the World Trust Educational Services? That's your organization,
Yes,
right? What is
yes,
it?
it is. We are an organization that produces film and for the purpose of dialogue, curricula, and workshops or presentations.
What kind of film could you?
We focus very much on, well, I shouldn't say very much, we focus on race and race in the United States. And so all of our films are about people having an opportunity to understand how racism actually works.
I think some of you, Cracking the Code, that's a pretty well-known film, right? When did that come out?
I finished that 3 years ago, so that would be 2013, 14, something like that.
Now, would this fall in the category of documentary or?
People refer to it as a documentary. I'm basically an educator, and so we make films so that people will be able to stop and actually talk, and which is very different than watching something and then you maybe talk to your friends about it. We want
I
the
like that.
conversation to happen in the room.
So, I mean, how does that work? There are pre-appointed places
Yes,
where people are
yes,
told,
yes.
turn off the DVD right now?
Just pause it, and
Pause it.
and all of the work that we do comes with conversation guides. So anybody can have the conversation. It doesn't have to be that a member from World Trust is there, but also we do go and work with people who want to not only look at the film but to take it deeper.
What a great concept. Now, I know you've been thinking a lot recently, or maybe it goes back quite a while, about the school-to-prison pipeline.
Yes, yes.
I think people hear that term a lot and maybe really don't know a lot about what's involved. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. I wouldn't call myself an expert on the school-to-prison pipeline. What I'm deeply interested in is what is justice. Because we understand that we have a highly disproportionate number of students of color who do find themselves on the road to ending up in prison repeatedly over the course of their lives for sometimes very minor infractions, sometimes serious infractions. But it begins with the fact that they're not being treated well, or they come to school with a lot of trauma. And people don't ask, what happened to you? They ask, what did you do? What did you do wrong? Well, if I saw my brother get beat up last night, or my father's in prison, or my mom is whatever, I'm going to come to school maybe not so interested in learning.
So nobody's, I think of the Harlem Kid Zone, where the approach was change a whole environment.
Right.
And you get different outcomes.
Yes.
We seem to be so eager to put people in prison. I mean, that's really that's the fact you're dealing with, isn't it?
Right.
With young people going to
Right.
prison
Right.
when they shouldn't.
Right.
And then it's formative for them.
Right. Well, there are a lot of studies that show that racism goes as far as interpreting who people are by the way they look. So, for example, you think about Tamir Rice, who was shot. When the officer called that in, he said, "We've just shot an African-American male, 20 years old." Tamir Rice was 12. But what happens is that when people are in that category of other, we don't really see them. The brain actually does not process information to allow you to see a person for who they are. And so it's very quick for this unconscious bias, which really overrides the conscious mind of the brain. It's very quick to move to a place where you defer people to categories in which they do not belong.
There's something terribly outmoded in our thinking about race, too, don't you think? Because the racial categories that have come down to us in the Americas and from Europe and other places have been completely undermined by the Human Genome Diversity Project.
Yes.
Where it turns out that there's there are greater differences within ethnic groups than there are separating ethnic groups. So the scientific base is totally gone for thinking about race.
Right. Well, I think what you're talking about is the difference between the biology of race and the cultural application of otherness, which race falls into that category. of course. So here's the deal. We don't think about race systemically. We think about race as, do you like me? Am I a good person? Am I racist? That's a real trigger. Am I racist? When really systems are all about understanding patterns and relationships. So the system of racialization really is, well, let me break it down this way. If we talk about your human body, your body as a system, you understand that there are a lot of parts that are working together in order to sustain your life. That is what the system is designed to do, is to sustain life. Your system, with all these different parts, have a lot of structures that support the system in doing its job. So your brain, your circulatory system, all of that kind of stuff. So the system of racialization is the same thing. It is designed, it has evolved into a system whose job it is to churn out inequities. The system of racialization is all about behavior that's embedded in history, which we do not learn, which impacts culture, which also informs who we are in terms of our identity formation. But it's moved by power and economics, and it has internal components and external components. The internal components are bias, both conscious and unconscious, privilege, and internalized racism, the wounding that happens when you hear messages repeatedly that tell you who you are. That you may or may not even be aware of at the time. But all of those internal components and the situatedness and the power and economics play out externally. They play out interpersonally. They play out in our institutions through policies and laws and customs, and that's just the way it's always been. And they play out structurally, which means institutional knowledge coming together to perpetuate basically the same message: who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's intelligent, who's not intelligent, all of that kind of stuff. And it's so deep in the history of our country, it's very hard to overcome.
It seems like you're talking about so many interesting things. If we unbundle some of the things you're talking about, it seems to me there are probably assumptions that if people actually face them singly, they wouldn't accept them. Let me just pick one. Phenotype. The idea that we can read a person's destiny and what that person is like based on skin color, body shape, hair, eye color, all of that. And put in those strict terms, a lot of people would say that can't possibly be right, and yet racism works that way, where those characteristics for a lot of people work as destiny. I look at you, I see those features, I know what the limits are in your life. People wouldn't accept that.
Well, I think the question that needs to be asked is, where did this knowledge, this perspective about phenotype, where did it come from, and for what purpose? So the human psyche has to rationalize why it would other people. If you need free labor, if you need cheap labor,
Right.
then you have to somehow be able to validate how you can treat people poorly.
Right.
And that becomes that gets embedded into the culture and passed on. I'll give you a different kind of example. So, I'm a very light-skinned African-American woman, and I grew up in Harlem. And when I would go to school, the first thing I would do when I got to history class is look in the back of the book to see where I was. Where were my people? We were never there. We weren't part of the intelligence, the leadership. Everything around me supported who belonged where. And even though I couldn't articulate it as a, junior high schooler, I knew something was missing. But I also had the advantage of going to the Schomburg Library all the time, where I found the answers of what African people have done. And so there's this disconnect between who we really are and what our history really is and how we're perceived in the United States.
The evidence of the last few years is that we desperately need to talk about race in a national conversation. And yet it seems to be America's most uncomfortable topic, the thing that never gets talked about in any direct way.
Right.
What would we have to do to have a national conversation about race, the one that we've needed to have for so long and never get around to?
Well, that's the work that I do. I think film is one way, but there are lots of other ways. I think as people become more aware of the dynamics, I'm talking about the regular, everyday person in the street, and they can move away from, am I a racist, to, I'm part of a system that's creating something that costs me as well as it costs you, that person of color. that we understand that we have linked fate, that our destinies are bound together, then we might have a better conversation about race because I don't have to defend myself as someone who's not a good person.
Instead of that knee-jerk reaction that people often have, I don't want to be made to feel guilty. You know,
Right.
it's not, if it were a personal problem, in a way, it wouldn't be a problem. It's a
Right.
social problem. And they
Right.
need to be part of that discussion, right?
Right. And I find that people really do want to talk about race. If there's an opening, if there's a way for them to get unstuck in all of that guilt and shame, which doesn't really serve anybody, we're born into systems we did not create. We're born into a history we didn't create. And because we didn't create it, once we recognize that we are part of it, then we have this amazing opportunity to actually be part of some solutions.
So what you were saying about the school-to-prison pipeline earlier is just an extreme, probably especially brutal expression of the sort of racial system in America that's working all the time that we're not talking about.
Right. But it's also nothing new. I mean, let's just talk about, the black codes, for example. So after the end of slavery, there was still a need for cheap labor. And so many, many laws were passed in order to pick people up for things like vagrancy, drinking too much, going after maybe white women or whatever it might be, that they could be arrested for, convicted, and then sold back to someone who needed their services, whether it was
contract the labor out.
It was contract labor. And so even when we talk about stop and search, that's nothing new. The right to control the physical space of a body based upon the economic needs for that labor, that's just continuing on. What we're seeing in the prison pipeline, however, is not just about the children, it's about their families. It's about generational harm that has been done over and over and over again and created patterns that then become how we stay impoverished or how we stay uneducated or how we stay traumatized by how it is that we're treated as human beings.
I think a lot of us had a kind of naive notion that with the election of Barack Obama, there would be a new era of openness and some racism would fall away. And it seems like, if anything, it's been intensified and uglier through the 8 years of his presidency. Has it gotten worse?
No.
Or is it just that people feel emboldened?
I think people are terrified. White people are terrified. And I say that as a general category because I personally refer to it as the dying breath of the dragon, so to speak. We need to move on. And what happens by move on, I mean become a more equitable society. I think that with the changing demographics, white people have a fear that is stirred by the press, by popular conversation that says you are being threatened and your way of life is being threatened. When that happens and people are acting out of fear, how they really feel comes to the surface. And so this way that Barack Obama, for example, can't even talk about race without being called that he's using the race card, but people heap all kinds of disrespect on him, this has been going on all along. And it doesn't override the fact that he's the president of the United States, how people really feel about the other. And this consistent effort to make him other is how you then rationalize your behavior.
It strikes me that to have the kind of racial discussion that you've been talking about would probably require leadership at the national level. I mean, people would have to model it. Politicians would have to be willing to call for it and in their own behavior model it. I don't think we've had that kind of leadership, have we? I mean, there hasn't been a national call for this kind of racial discussion.
Well, I think there are many national calls for the discussion.
Okay.
But because we are depending upon information from the press, we don't necessarily know that those discussions, that dialogue is really happening. If it's not reported and you're not in it, how are you going to know about it? I think there are many, many, many efforts to create equity in this country. And we have to somehow, the people have to be able to connect the dots among the organizations and experiences that are actually allowing people to talk about race in a way that is useful.
Maybe the tendency of the far right, if I could just be very general for a second, to give people license not to do that, to sometimes reinforce their biases and discriminatory behavior and so on, hasn't been helpful either, wouldn't you say?
No, are you familiar with Professor Ian Hanley?
No.
So Ian Hanley wrote a book called Dog Whistle Politics. And dog whistle politics is really all about the fact that we talk about race all the time, but it's coded. So when we talk about the welfare queen or urban whatever it might be, or we talk about all kinds of things that are actually happening in our contemporary society, we are talking about race and naming people as other without using the words. Mm-hmm. That's very dangerous. Mm-hmm. It's designed to stimulate fear. It's designed to keep us separated. And it is part of the biggest lie, which is that we are leading separate lives, we are individuals, and we're not connected. But that disconnection is killing all of us, because if I am disconnected from myself, and I'm disconnected from you, and I'm disconnected from the earth, what is there? I don't have a vested interest in your well-being. That's the very nature of divide and conquer. It's how it works.
The sort of granular approach where everybody is encouraged to see things from a very limited perspective and be fearful of other perspectives.
An individualistic perspective. U.S. culture is all about rugged individualism. And of course, we want people to develop their full potential in life. But that doesn't mean that you are an individual doing everything by yourself. You can't eat a meal, get dressed, do anything without the services of so many other people who make it possible for you to go into that store and buy your food, put it on your table, cook it on some people. We are connected in terms of not only our labor, but as a species.
Right. Speaking of politicians having sometimes a bad, negative impact, the presidential candidates over the last year have been inflammatory very often in their racial comments, all the way up through the present. What's the impact of that been?
I think that, I'm speaking for myself here. I think that the purpose of this inflammatory conversation not only re-stimulates this individualistic idea of who we are and that we need to be afraid of the other, I think it's also designed to, under the guise of presenting hope, really stirs hopelessness. Mm-hmm. It really says, this is too much. I mean, I remember when Reagan was running for president, it was like, well, if he wins, I'm going to move out of the country. Yeah. Well, I'm still here, and so are many other people. I think people undersell Donald Trump and the cards that he's playing. And if he were to be elected, God forbid, if he were to be elected, I think that what would happen is that there would be a big uprising by people who understand how bad this is for our country. And sometimes that needs to happen. Let me say this. We are so trained to think in a linear way. We think of pathways from where we are to equity. But it doesn't work that way. Life is much more circulatory and nuanced, so that we make some progress here, we fall back, we make some progress there, we fall back, until it reaches an epic point and there can actually be a general shift in consciousness, meaning more people are buying into and understanding that it's in our best interest collectively to make life work for everyone. Mm-hmm. And until we get to that point, until we have enough bad things that we're resisting, it is scary, but we have to keep working it.
I, of course, like what you're saying, but the idea that we may need to elect Donald Trump
No, I didn't say
in
that.
order to be shocked enough that we change courses is, I'm not sure I like to.
No, I'm saying
there.
We may need to. I don't believe we need to. I said if he were to win. I mean, in my heart of hearts, that's not where I'm going with it.
No, I know.
But I think that if we underestimate what he represents, we're making a huge mistake.
I've noticed that a lot of people are starting to talk about a kind of fork in the road with the next election.
Right.
That there really could be a degrading of the country's future if it goes one way, and not that it'll be, roses and milk and honey, you go the other, but the other way would not be disastrous. Do you have that sense a little bit?
I don't know. I generally feel it's all pretty myopic. You know, what it
But
will take in order for this country to really step into its greatness is a rising up of the people. We don't have a general election, really. We have an electoral vote process that is not representative of the people, that was put into place intentionally at the time by slaveholders who wanted to be sure that the minority of people who had the same interests would really overcome what the general public said. I think it will take a rising up met by a top-down direction or leadership, as you refer to it, in order to make real change. We don't tell enough good stories of what can be. We spend a lot of time talking about what's not working, and of course that needs to be there, but we also need to tell stories that say, this is what possibility looks like.
doesn't it seem also that the two major political parties really missed the boat? The protest vote that Donald Trump is appealing to, the protest vote that Bernie Sanders, neither party seemed to see this coming, and that's a little scary.
Right. Well, you know what? I have to admit to you that I'm much more focused on what can be. While I was here at NCORE, I hosted a panel that talked about radical healing. And radical healing, from the perspective of the author who wrote several books, Sean Ginwright, talks about the work that he does with young Black and brown kids is really about re-stimulating imagination and hope and possibility. Because if that gets lost, if we end up just talking about how bad things are and we don't look ahead about what could be, we miss the boat of really being able to make change. And it's not going to come because someone says, if you do A, B, and C, you'll get to D. You know, that's how we want to get to the answers, but we have to also figure out what it means to actually be together. So we create films where people can be together, talk about race, get upset or not upset, but actually leave asking some new questions about what could be.
I think a lot of people who see this show are going to be intrigued by a number of things that you've said, genuinely engaged. But they're going to say to themselves, well, she's a filmmaker and she's got a kind of microphone to the culture, and I'm not. What message could you give folks watching the show that would allow them maybe to take a step in the right direction, to act, to do something good? What would you like to say to people?
I think at the very least, people can become more educated about the issues. There's so much written material. If the least of what you did was to read something you normally wouldn't read to get a different perspective about how does structural racism actually work, then you would be more informed to have a conversation that's less about you and more about a system. So at base level, everyone can participate in that. I also feel like if we do start having conversations, this national conversation that you talked about, that I'm deeply invested in having, we get to learn about each other in ways that are very powerful.
Would your film Cracking the Code be a good place for people to start?
Yeah, Cracking the Codes is, well, thanks for that, but Cracking the Codes is a great film because it goes through the system of racial inequity through stories, so that you actually get to hear a critical mass of stories that you may never have considered or that's been part of your life, but you get to have a place where you can meet and talk without having to feel, especially if you're a white person, that you're a bad person. Or even if you're a person of color who really hasn't thought about these issues very much, because that's true also, you have a way that you can actually engage.
Where could people go most directly to find your film? Would they go on Amazon? Would they go to YouTube? Or...
No, they would go to my website. It's world-trust.org.
And Cracking the Codes.
Cracking the Codes is on there. All of the work, we create a lot of curriculum that's on there. We have a lot of research information that's on there as well.
As we talk, we're at the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in San Francisco, the annual conference. What role do you think organizations like NCORE can play?
Huge. I think this is what I see. I've been coming to this conference since 1998. And it's where I first showed The Way Home, my very first film. People come here from all over the country and they leave renewed. Because oftentimes on their campuses or wherever they're working, they're very heavily siloed or meet a lot of opposition to make change. So people being able to connect and to actually be reinvigorated to go back and bring the conversations up and the learning up that needs to happen takes place here at this conference.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to stick your neck out a little bit. Look ahead as far as you can, 10, 20 years down the road. What do you think will happen in the area of social justice? Make a prediction, something good or bad that you see on the horizon that you think will have a big impact on all of us.
Okay, you want a quick answer here.
Well, yeah, yes, I do. Yes, I do.
I think the whole notion of good and bad has us a little bit in trouble. I see the progress of possibility and hope really moving forward, and we have some opportunities to do that, or we can stay unconscious, and in that case, just keep perpetuating inequity in ways that people will eventually resist. We resist inequity at some point, as clearly demonstrated by Black Lives Matter. If people get pressed down, they're going to resist. And so this struggle for equity is a very important one. And my hope is that we're moving in that direction.
Let me make sure that I understand you. Are you saying that people are going to come together in their fight for social justice? Or
people come together when they're pressured to fight for social justice.
That will happen.
That will happen.
On the horizon.
As inequity continues and people are unhappy about not being able to have basic services, education, transportation, they come together and they work for change.
I like that vision of the future.
Yeah.
Shakti Butler, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.